still wouldn't be enough. Tuku not want my really. When you hear completely. Tuku my rope and more. If he can do that, we say now. What shall I render to Jehovah?
Good night, Tobago. Good night, Tobagonians, wherever you are. Good night, viewers of the podcast. Just want to apologize for the late start. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but I think it will be worth the wait tonight. Tonight we have with us a special guest, Dr. Terence Farrell. Just by way of introduction, Dr. Farrell, who is a PhD in economics, he's a graduate of the Hewing Law School, so he's versed in legal matters. He's a former central bank governor. He's also a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, so he can speak to us about corporate governance as well. And he is also a director of a number of private companies. I think he wears many hats. Most recently, he was the member of the Constitutional Reform Committee. And that's where I interacted for the first time with Dr. Farrell. And just by way of introduction of him to the program, at that point, I spoke about the issue of that dictators don't ever give up power. And I intimated at the time that the constitutional reform would go nowhere. I think I was right about it. It has gone nowhere. But we are not here to talk about that tonight. When I mentioned that, there was a response I got from him that I think it's worthwhile us, it's worthwhile him recounting that. And just to jog his memory a bit, if he might have forgotten, he said, and I can't paraphrase him, but generally trusted the discussion was that if we thought 1990 was bad, there are a lot of young men with big guns walking around. And the idea was he was painting a picture of the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. And I don't want to try to paraphrase anymore. So what I might ask Dr. Farrell to do is to just recount that whole explanation about the state of the economy and why he thinks we are in dire straits at this point in time. Dr. Farrell.
Oh, well, good evening, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to talk to Tobago and to talk to Tobagonians. I have a special place in my heart. In fact, I've been married to a Tobagonian for 44 years, so I'm always happy to talk to Tobago and Tobagonians. To your point, I think one of the reasons why, just to touch briefly on the constitutional reform exercise, one of the reasons why I agreed to participate in that is because I was actually quite convinced that we do need in our country today, we need to have serious institutional reform and constitutional reform. That the institutions that we have been running in this society and in the economy for the last 50 years are no longer serving us well. And a lot of the pathologies that we are seeing, and every week in Trinidad, it's a new issue. We have the Commissioner of Police and the Police Service Commission last week, and next week is going to be something else. That these pathologies are reflective of pathological institutions. The institutions are not functioning as they should. Obviously, there are people problems as well. But if you have strong institutions, then you will overcome the problem of individual malfeasance or even individual incompetence. But where the institutions are not properly structured and are not working well, it means that either incompetence or corruption or malfeasance and so on kind of begins to take over and gets us to where we are. Where are we as far as the economy is concerned? We are not. Let me just say we are not in a desperate situation. Let me underline that. We are not in a desperate situation as far as the economy is concerned, but we are not in a good place. And the reason for that is that the, the, the fundamental driver of the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, which is our energy sector, has been in decline for going on 10, 12 years now. So that natural gas production has been declining. Since that time, we are now down to about 2.5 BCF per day, from a high of 4.2 BCF. At that level, 4.2 BCF, we had enough gas to provide for LNG, to provide for the petrochemical companies at a decent price. At 2.5 BCF, we are in some difficulties as far as that is concerned. As far as crude oil is concerned, our crude oil production actually peaked way back in 1978. So that our crude oil production today in Trinidad is actually around the same level as it was in the 1950s, even before independence. So the energy sector, that engine that drives a lot of economic activity, and a lot of it through the government budget, and so that's something that we can talk about, through the government budget, that engine is slowing. And as a consequence of that, we are seeing two related things happening at a sort of macroeconomic level. One is that the government, as revenues begin to decline, government attempts to respond to that by increasing our debt, so that you see over the course of the last 10, 15 years, our domestic and external debt rising consistently, almost inexorably. And then the second aspect of that, which is actually related, is that as you continue to drive the economy by running deficits on your fiscal account, which we've been doing, except for 1 year, we had a roughly balanced budget, but we've been running consistent fiscal deficits. The part of the consequence of that is that in the absence of any exchange rate adjustment, our foreign exchange reserves have been declining and have been declining steadily. So we have come down from at the end of 2014, where we had peaked at about 11.5 billion US dollars of foreign exchange reserves, and we had about another 5 or 6 billion in the HSF. We are now down to about 5.5 billion in reserves. The HSF is about 6 billion, so it's about flat. And we have drawn out from the HSF and we put a little bit back in, and the HSF continues to generate some earnings, but basically it has been flat. But more importantly, the foreign exchange reserves have come down. And the only reason why we are at 5.5 billion in terms of our foreign exchange reserves is that because we have borrowed money, and we got another almost 700 million US dollars from the IMF with its allocation that was done about a year and a half ago. So the economy is not in good shape. We are seeing the problems in terms of foreign exchange availability, which is affecting a lot of sectors of the economy, including, but also affecting individuals who want to have access to foreign exchange. And we are struggling to try to get the economy adjusted, getting it working, and we are also importantly struggling to get growth going again. And within that context, if I may say so, if you come to the specific problems about Tobago, because the Tobago economy is within the construct of Trinidad and Tobago, the Tobago economy is even weaker. Because the Tobago economy is dependent almost entirely on government transfers to the Tobago House of Assembly, and the Tobago House of Assembly, pretty much like the central government in Trinidad, essentially uses the funds it is getting from the budget, the 2 point something billion that you are getting from the central government budget, essentially to support consumption, so that 55-60% of the labor force in Tobago continue to be employed by the Tobago House of Assembly. And that is simply not sustainable.
Okay. So Dr. Farrell, you kind of touched indirectly on an issue that I've been raising since I have started this program, probably 2 episodes ago. The issue of the Dutch disease and how that has affected and the kind of implications it has for what you just mentioned in terms of corruption, in terms of mismanagement of state resources and so on. Could you just, amplify a bit on the Dutch disease and whether or not it really exists and whether or not it's actually affecting us here?
Yeah. So we have. I would say we have two related problems. One of them is as you describe it, is Dutch disease, and so let me just explain for the benefit of your listeners what that is. Dutch disease is that if we think about the economy of an economy like Trinidad, that as being comprised of two sectors, so that one sector is really your export sector. So in our case, it is oil and natural gas, which is your export sector. What the Dutch disease phenomenon is that what happens is that as the export sector is growing, exports are growing, maybe export prices are high. What happens is that it drives wages up in the export sector, so that people who are working in the oil and gas sector in Trinidad, for example, are able to enjoy relatively high wages, which that sector can afford because they are exporting and they're making a lot of money. So the companies like BP and Woodside and Shell and so on, they pay high salaries, and the people who are working there can afford to pay high salaries. The problem, though, is that the rest of the economy, the other sectors of the economy, now try to increase wages. So wages tend to rise in those other sectors, but those other sectors are not in a position to afford to do that. So that what you have is that with Dutch disease, you have this perverse effect that a sector, the export sector, which is growing, which is booming, actually causes the other sectors of the economy to, in fact, to contract, which is a bit of a paradox, right? Because you would think that if the export sector is growing and so on, the entire economy is in fact going to grow. But the Dutch disease phenomenon, which was first sort of identified in, I think it was in the Netherlands. That's why it's called Dutch disease, because they had discovered gas and they had this particular phenomenon. That you've had the situation where your export sector is doing well, but you have this perverse effect because of rising wages in the rest of the economy, where the rest of the economy is not doing as well and begins to contract. So that your sectors, for example, like agriculture, your sectors like manufacturing, and so on, because of the pressure of these higher wages, don't do as well, profits are low, and you get this kind of effect. Now, if you look at Trinidad and Tobago's history over the course of the last, 50, 60 years, you actually see something like this kind of phenomenon here. So that our agriculture sector, for example, is extremely weak. The agriculture sector accounts for about 1% of GDP. Because, of course, we no longer have sugar, the cocoa sector is struggling, domestic agriculture is very weak. We have an exchange rate which favors the importation of foods of all kinds from all over the place, and we import a lot of things. We import a lot of wheat products. We import a lot of rice. We import. It's quite amazing, actually. So our food bill is high because it is much easier and it's much more affordable for us to do that given the exchange rate. So the Dutch disease has been a problem. The other problem that I want to identify for you and for your listeners is what is termed rent-seeking behavior. What that means is that if you think again about the energy sector generates a lot of revenues from the sale of oil and gas and so on overseas. The government taxes the energy sector. The government then spends that money. Now, the problem is that the government wants to spend that money, but basically it does that by trying to keep as many people employed as possible. So it is employing people, but it is not necessarily the people that the government is employing are high productivity jobs. They are not, right? So here you have two problems. One is that you are taking a resource out of the ground, our natural gas and our oil, and you take it out of the ground, you monetize it, right? And it is monetized through the government budget. And instead of treating it as a capital asset, we consume it, right? So what then happens is that there's a lot of competition in the economy for these rents, as we call them. These rents from the energy sector flowing to the government. There's a lot of competition for it. There's a competition for it on the part of the labor movement who want to have as many people employed as possible. There's competition for it on the part of contractors, people who want to build roads and they want to build hospitals and they want to build police stations and they want to build all kinds of things that they want to build. But all of that is actually feeding off of the rents being generated by the energy sector. So the problem that we have is that this then generates what we call this kind of rent-seeking behavior, where people are actually pursuing getting money from the government because it is easier for them to do that. It is easier for them to generate either wage income by becoming employed in the public service. You have a lot of state enterprises, you have a lot of all these boards and so on all around the place and so on. And therefore that means that you have a large number of people who are absorbed in the public sector. But the public sector is not a very high productivity sector. So if you think about it, what you're doing is that you are taking a resource from a high productivity sector, which is the energy sector, and you're transferring those resources into a low productivity sector. And therefore, it leads a situation where your economic growth tends to be very low, very anemic, and that is exactly what we are seeing in Trinidad and Tobago. So over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, and if you could go even further back than that, you see very, very weak growth. So that despite the fact that we've had all of this oil and gas money flowing through the economy and so on, the economy is not growing particularly fast. And another way of looking at it, another way of looking at it is that if you look at an economy like Trinidad, with all of the oil and gas that we've had, and you look at an economy like Barbados, 500 miles away, which has zero, well, they have a little bit of oil, not much, but certainly no natural gas, no resources of any kind. And Barbados's income is about the same as ours. And in fact, the Barbados economy is doing extremely well compared to ours. Where we should have been way ahead of a place like Barbados, we are about the same. So we have these two problems: the Dutch disease problem, which you talked about, which is sort of depressing or suppressing the non-energy sector in the economy. And then the second problem that we have is this problem of rent seeking, where people are pursuing extracting these rents, going into wages, going into more unproductive kinds of activity.
Yes, so Dr. Farrell, what I was trying to get at while you were explaining then, I think your explanation helped me get to the point. Barbados, I think the economy of Barbados is quite similar to the economy of Tobago. Yes?
Yes.
In terms of tourism, limited agriculture, as the case may be.
Yes.
And if you had to advise to the THA, because there is this idea which I'm trying to dispel, that getting the oil and gas off of 6 nautical miles or 60 nautical miles off of Tobago will solve all of Tobago's problems. And I don't think that to be true. And you just juxtapose a situation where Barbados, which is quite similar to Tobago, is doing as well as Trinidad and Tobago without oil and gas. What would you advise the THA in that kind of conundrum? as to how you might want to proceed, even if you were able to get this oil and gas off of your 6 miles or your 60 nautical miles, whatever the case is.
Well, we can talk about Tobago's 60 miles or whatever it is, 11 miles and nautical miles. But yes, you're quite right. So the economy of Tobago is very much like the economy of Barbados, because you're talking about two economies, two countries that are really very small. And that Tobago is only about, the population of Tobago is 60,000 people. The population of Barbados is under 300,000. So when you are in that kind of situation, as a very small island state, your options for economic growth and development are very, very limited. That's the reality. There are certain things that you simply can't do because you don't have the scale, you don't have the number of people, you don't have the capacity to do certain kinds of things. Okay. Now, so the easiest thing for countries like that to do are to try to scale up by doing tourism. This is the beauty of tourism. You take a place like Jamaica, which has a population of 2.7 million people, and Jamaica attracts every year about 2 million tourists. So what you do with tourism in Jamaica is that you effectively double your population. In the case of Barbados, under 300,000 people, effectively Barbados is, I don't have any, I haven't checked the visitor arrivals, but let's assume Barbados gets 1 million tourists a year coming into Barbados. So Barbados triples and quadruples its population every year through tourism. And that's the beauty of tourism. And that is exactly what Tobago needs to do. So that at one point in time, I had done some work for the Tobago House of Assembly when Mr. Joel Jack was the Secretary of Finance. And we'd done a plan where if you will recall, of course, the infamous Sandals project, which some voices in Tobago rejected, which I think was very unfortunate, because the key to Tobago's development, irrespective of whatever else you think that you might be able to do, the key has to be the development of a strong, viable tourism sector. Because what that will do is that it will scale up Tobago. So instead of having catering for a population of 60,000, you could be, and we did some of the numbers for the Secretary of Finance at the time, Secretary of Finance and Economy, where if Tobago had about 3 all-inclusive resorts of the size of a Sandals, and you were able to attract airlift into Tobago, which is what Sandals would have brought, or which some other all-inclusive operators would have brought. And then from there, you then move into your ecotourism, you move into your event tourism, and you move into other kinds of tourism. Because I think what is very important to understand, I think, that things like ecotourism and event tourism and so on don't happen by themselves. And even if they were to happen, they will never give you the kind of scale that you need to have an economy that is very strong and very viable. Ecotourism and event tourism are very niche kinds of things. So you build those things on the back of a kind of a more mass kind of tourism, which you get with the all-inclusives. And the mass kind of tourism, which you come in with the all-inclusives, also gives you the airlift that then allows you to, for example, the airport that you're building in Tobago now. I don't know who you're building the airport for, because you can't build that airport of that size and scale to handle people coming from Trinidad to hang out. That airport is justified if you have 500,000 people, 500,000 international visitors coming to Tobago on a yearly basis, and then you have another 500,000 visitors coming through from Trinidad and from the rest of the Caribbean, so that Tobago is then dealing with visitors of 1 million visitors a year over the course of a year. That scales up the Tobago economy in a significant kind of way. And as I said, on the back of that kind of tourism, you then build your event tourism, you build your ecotourism, you build all those other kinds of exotic kinds of tourism. You build your Airbnb type things if people want to do that kind of thing and so on. But the critical thing is that if you have the airlift, you have a functioning airport, the destination becomes very well known to people around the world and so on, you can then build those other things, as I'm saying, off of it. So that is what Tobago is, and this is what Barbados has done so tremendously successfully. And you look at the airport in Barbados, and you compare the airport with Piarco, and it tells you everything. The place Barbados is oriented towards welcoming the tourists because they understand that the tourist is extremely important to their livelihoods, to their economic prosperity, and they try to do their best in terms of service and so on and so forth, so that people come back and they tell their friends and they tell their family and so on, and you build a destination and so on in that kind of way. And you see, the other things too, Barry, is that the other things that we talk about with tourism then begin to follow, so that agriculture then begins to follow that. If you have 500,000 tourists coming through to Tobago every year, then there is going to be scope for certain kinds of agriculture in Tobago to produce certain kinds of things, which becomes very difficult for you to import, right? So things like your vegetables and your fruits and so on and so forth, then there is capacity to grow those things in Tobago, which then stimulates the agricultural sector in Tobago to feed into that. And Tobago has some very important advantages, which I think a lot of the other Caribbean islands. Barbados does have their crop over festival in August, but Tobago, and I think separating the Tobago Carnival from the Trinidad Carnival was a very important move, and I think it's a very sensible move to separate it. But you're piggybacking off of the whole Trinidad Carnival experience with the steel band and the mass and the type of thing and so on, which the other islands, quite frankly, don't have, or they don't do it as well as we do. And then Tobago also has the ecotourism. You have the longest or the oldest reserve, nature reserve in the hemisphere, in Tobago. So there is scope for other kinds of tourism, the heritage tourism, the fact that the history of Tobago is so interesting because of the Dutch and the Spanish and the English and so on, and the fact that you have, for example, in the Scarborough Harbour, there was a famous battle that took place there, and apparently there are ships that are sunk in the Scarborough Harbour, and so all of that becomes fascinating. Around Tobago, in terms of the marine ecology of Tobago, the fishing, the scuba diving, all those kinds of things, the deep sea activities, which you don't have in some of these other places like Barbados. So Tobago has a lot of advantages, a lot of potential opportunity if it sets about the task and it does it right. But I think, unfortunately, I think that the rejection of the sandals thing was a mistake. But even if you rejected sandals, the idea of having large scale, I call it all inclusive, or it could be, doesn't matter, it's all inclusive ENP. But once you have large numbers of people coming into 2 or 3, because I don't think Tobago has capacity for more than that, 2 or 3 of that size, and then you piggyback other kinds of products on top of that.
A matter which I would like you to expand a bit on, the issue of state board management.
Yes.
And in fact, we have a number of THA companies, and
Yes.
Simple things like audited financial statement, having your AGMs and so on. These things are like non-existent. You have done a review of state boards in Trinidad. What's your experience doing that, and how do you advise in a case where we have so many state boards that seem to lack transparency, to lack accountability, to lack any kind of concept of management?
Well, I also did an exercise in Tobago.
Okay.
on the state enterprises in Tobago, for Joel Jack, and it's very interesting in terms of doing these kinds of things, because sometimes we do these things and then a new administration comes in as if nothing has ever happened before. Everything that has gone before is kind of is discarded and forgotten. But a lot of work was done in that period. We had developed a medium-term plan for Tobago. We had done some work precisely on developing the tourism sector. I had reviewed for Secretary Jack. I had reviewed the Tobago state enterprises because they're obviously problematic. And they are very peculiar. The Tobago state enterprises are very peculiar in the sense that they kind of exist in a certain kind of limbo, if you like, because they fall under the Tobago House of Assembly. They don't fall under the central government, and therefore the governance of those state enterprises, because they are state enterprises, they kind of fall between stools, if you like, in terms of accountability. And what we found, obviously, just like the ones in Trinidad, because we did the exercise in Trinidad in 2016, we reviewed, I think, about 49 state enterprises in Trinidad. Almost all of the wholly owned state enterprises we reviewed in Trinidad, except for the ones in the petroleum sector, Petrotrin and so on. We didn't do Petrotrin. And we did a special report on TSTT. So we reviewed those. And essentially the problem is the same. The pathology is the same. The pathology is poor governance. The pathology is that many of those enterprises are set up and are sustained because they sustain employment for people. Not that they produce anything or that they do anything that is particularly productive, but they employ people. And the second important thing why they continue to exist is that they are very important for political patronage. The governments like them, the politicians like these state enterprises, because they are a way of rewarding the party faithful by giving people positions on these state boards and so on. So whether these entities in fact end up making money or they don't make money and so on becomes almost irrelevant until they get into trouble. And some of them, if they are particularly big. So, for example, if you are like a Petrotrin, for example, Petrotrin is huge, a very dominant force in the economy of Trinidad in terms of the petroleum sector and so on, gets itself into trouble. And the genesis of the problems in the Petrotrin case go back to the late 1990s. In fact, it goes back even further than that. And so, therefore, you have a lot of mounting debt. You had a lot of failed projects with Petrotrin. And eventually the government decides to close it down, and they move. It accumulated a huge amount of debt. We've had problems back in the day with state enterprises like some of the commercial banks, which was owned by the state. So it is when they get into trouble that they then have an impact on the government's finances. They have implications for the taxpayer, who then has to support these or to bail out these enterprises. And the Tobago ones are no different. They're a lot smaller, but the pathology is exactly the same. And I think there were about 8 of them that we looked at, and we made our recommendations to the Secretary of Finance at the time as to what could be done with some of these. But that's the pathology.
Just to go a bit further in terms of some of my thoughts on some of these state enterprises. So for example, let's see Pigeon Point and possibly all the beach facilities in Tobago that you might want to think of, including the Esplanade, that you probably put them maybe under one board. And what you do is that you sell that off in shares to Tobagonians, so that Tobagonians kind of own the beach facilities, and then in that way you get better accountability now, because you have quote unquote more private company that is driven in a different direction than it would be in terms of if it were just a wholly owned state. And a classical example of that is Studley Park, which just sits there with billions of dollars that we can use to power the Tobago economy, and that place has not made money since Jesus was a little boy. And what in terms of making these companies private companies in the context of making them owned by Tobagonians rather than owned by the THA, do you see any value in that kind of construct?
I think it depends on what the nature of the enterprise in the first place. So there are some enterprises, there are some state entities for where that model is not appropriate, because those entities they're not necessarily providing a commercial a service. So we, in our report, which I can probably share with you because this is almost 10 years old now, in our report we made a distinction between enterprises which are commercially oriented. So for example, Caribbean Airlines is a commercial entity. It's owned by the state, but Caribbean Airlines competes head to head with American Airlines, with every airline, every foreign airline, JetBlue, all those airlines. So Caribbean Airlines is a competitive space. First Citizens Bank, it's owned largely by the state, but it is competing head to head with Scotiabank and Citibank and so on. So you have those enterprises which are in a commercial space providing a good or a service into the market, and it happens to be owned wholly or in part by the state. And those entities have to be treated differently. Petrotrin, for example, is also would have been a good example of that, or Heritage Petroleum now is a good example of that. And then you have another set of enterprises which carry out a social purpose, so that, for example, they may be involved in housing, for example, like the Housing Development Corporation, or the Urban Development Corporation, or entities like that. So not all of them are suitable for privatization. What we had recommended as a sort of a general approach to the thing is that we suggested the New Zealand model, whereby what happens is similar to what you're suggesting. What happens in the New Zealand model is that you recognize that there's a public purpose for the existence of the enterprise, so that there is some state ownership of the enterprise. But you also recognize that the governance and the drive for profitability and so on is going to be enhanced by private participation in the enterprise. Okay? So how do you marry those two things? Well, what the model does is that the model says, well, okay, the state is going to have something like, in some cases, a golden share. Right? So that in the event that anything happens, the state has the ability to take control of the enterprise. The second thing is that you then put the governance, it has a very clear mandate, very clear mission. You say, this is what you are supposed to do. And the board carries out that mandate. If the board attempts to deviate from that mandate, well, then the government steps in or the parliament steps in, and you remove those people and you put people who will carry out the mandate. Part of the problem with a lot of our state enterprises is that their mandate is not clear, or they start out with some particular mandate, and within the next 10 years they're off doing something else because somewhere along the line the politician decides, well, I want to get something done, and you give it a state enterprise to do. I don't know if you remember the very interesting case that we had in Trinidad some years ago, where we had the Tourism Industrial Development Corporation building roads, paving roads. So that's the kind of thing that tends to happen with these enterprises. So there has to be clarity of what the mandate is, where it is appropriate. You bring private sector participation and certainly private sector governance into the operation of the state enterprise. The government, ministers, and so on have to keep their hands out of it. Patronage has to stop. They have to recognize that these are not places where they just simply put in their party faithful, people who are unqualified to be on boards, who have no experience, and so on, and you put them onto the boards, and therefore, within no time at all, you find that these entities are struggling because they are not being properly run.
A big bugbear question is this whole issue of autonomy. Yes, Tobago's autonomy. And
Yes.
Being a legal practitioner, I'm sure you might have looked at the THA Act in the context, and also being on the Constitutional Reform Committee as well. I'm sure
Yes.
you would have come across some recommendations on the whole issue of autonomy.
We did.
What's your sensing of how Tobago should engage this whole process of autonomy, and what do you see as some of the major issues, challenges in the current act that, if you were to advise the teacher, you might want to suggest this might be an area that you might look at to make some serious adjustment to, such that it allows for this whole autonomy, self-determination, whatever construct you want to call it.
Okay. So my views on that are very how should I put it? They're quite strong, and I'm quite sure they're not particularly popular. They wouldn't be very particularly popular in Tobago. Uh, I consider myself to be a realist, okay, and I think that Tobago and Tobagonians have to be real. You have a small island. It is 116 square miles, and you have 60,000 people on the island. So you taking that, starting there, you have to then tailor your ambitions accordingly. Tobago was yoked to Trinidad against its will, because people argue that that the Tobagonians were not consulted and the British government just simply did it, which is true. All of that is true. That the British simply yoked Tobago to Trinidad and put it as a ward of Trinidad in 1899. And that has been a source of resentment in Tobago for a very long time. And I understand that. There's been a lot of work done more recently by people like Susan Craig and Rita Pemberton and so on, talking about the very different history of Tobago, a different social history, a different way of being, a different way. But at the same time, over the course of the last 125 years, Tobago has become part of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a unitary state. It is not two states. It is not a federation. It is one state. It is one place, right? That happens to be two islands. That's what it is now. And so the notion that some people have that somehow Tobago is a separate place, and then what you will do is that you then have to create a federation. To create a federation means that the things have to separate. They first have to separate before you could create a federation. And so you have to cut it first before you then think about having a federation. And if you were to do that, so if Tobago were to secede, for example, right, and a lot of people who talk about autonomy and so on, when you mention the word secede, you mention secession, they say no, that's not what we mean.
But
I'm not quite sure.
If you might just hold that point for a little bit, right? Because I think somewhere, I think it might have been in the Sunday newspapers or some newspapers last week, I would have seen where the World Bank would have intervened, done a report in the context of, I think, St. Kitts and Nevis, where they were recommending some kind of approach to revenue sharing. I don't know if that came across your visor, and if it did,
no, but St. Kitts Nevis is a federation.
All right, good. So I'm going to that point now. So the argument might be why shouldn't Tobago pursue the federation type arrangement if in fact it seems to be working. I mean, St. Kitts and Nevis, in terms of their GDP per capita, in terms of their performances, I think they're doing quite well. So the argument would be, being the devil's advocate here, why not a federation?
Well, so I'm saying that if you wanted to do a federation, Tobago would first have to secede. You would because I understand what's happening here, Barry. Right now, what you have is one state. It's a unitary state. It's one place, right? If Tobago secedes, okay, then you then have two states, right? I don't think it's possible for you to secede, but let's suppose that you did, right? And you then said, okay, now that Tobago is a separate state, you then say to Trinidad, we want to now federate with you, right? then that decision is no longer a Tobago decision. It is a Trinidad decision to decide whether it wants to federate with Tobago.
Okay.
You see what I mean? So it is not your choice. You could then decide, if you separated, you could say, well, I could have a federation with Grenada, you could federate with Barbados, you could federate with Jamaica if you wanted to.
Okay.
Why does it have to be Trinidad? You see what I mean? So I'm saying that the first thing that you have to do is to secede. And let me just say very clearly, Barry, and I say to you and to all those who have been talking about this thing and so on, it is going to be, the probability of Tobago successfully unilaterally declaring independence, that is to secede from the United States of Trinidad and Tobago, and getting the world to recognize it is close to zero. The United Nations will not recognize you. The whole question, which is, if you look at our report, you will see that this whole idea of self-determination as a construct in international law does not apply in the context of Tobago situation. Just as in the case, and we use the parallel with Canada and the Quebec situation, all right? And it's the same, the parallel is there. And therefore you cannot use self-determination because Tobago is not a colony of Trinidad. And so therefore you can't secede. So if you went to the United Nations tomorrow morning, if the THA went to tomorrow, not the THA, because the THA can't go, but it'd have to be some entity in Tobago, goes to the United Nations tomorrow morning and says, we want to secede from Trinidad, the United Nations will not give you a hearing, I'm sorry to say.
Okay.
You will not get a hearing. But you could secede unilaterally, you could do that, I suppose. But if you did that, I'm coming back to my point, then the decision to have a federation with Trinidad on terms that you think are appropriate then becomes a decision for Trinidad. Trinidad may decide that we don't want to federate with you.
Okay. Okay.
So
But no, point well taken. Point well taken. Point well
Yes.
taken, Doc.
Yeah.
Let's see. What I might want to do now, Doc, is kind of take you through just for the few minutes remaining interview that you did with Mr. Ramisa.
Ramisa, yes.
Yeah, where I think you looked at this whole question of what was the name of your book again? My memory slips here now.
Oh, the Underachieving Society. That's the one he was talking about.
The Underachieving Society.
Achieving
And you
Society,
mentioned a number of things inside there about the role of economic planning and
Yes.
how that was stopped, thwarted as the case may be.
Yes.
So I want to ask you to deal with that a bit in the Tobago case, because I'm not aware that we have any plan. Well, I think I know the last plan might have been the CDP plan. I am not aware
Yes.
that we have any now. So just, for the sake of the audience, speak to the fact of, why you need to have this economic plan in place, why you need to have an economic plan at any rate. And what was the benefit of having these 5-year rolling plans, and whether or not that's something that Tobago should look at doing and introducing?
I think the answer is yes. I am a believer in planning, and therefore one of the things that we have to be very careful about is that we're not talking about what is kind of like old style Soviet planning, okay, where the state decides how many eggs to be produced and how many. No. I am a believer, quite frankly, that we should let the market operate as to the greatest extent that is possible for it to operate. The market is a wonderful thing. It works extremely well. The problem with the market sometimes is that for certain kinds of things, the market is distorting. The market, as we in economics we say, the market fails. So we talk about market failure. Right? The market fails. The market is not good at doing certain kinds of things. The market is not good at doing certain things, for example, related to public goods or related to things that what we call merit goods. So things like education and health and infrastructure and those types of things and so on, the market is not good at doing those things because those are critical products and services which are used by everybody. They're in common use. And the market is about proprietary behavior. It is about what profits me. It's about what profits, about self-interest, going back to Adam Smith. It's about self-interest, is what is good for me. And so therefore there are certain kinds of things where it is important for the state, for the government to get involved. So there are two things here. One is that the government must therefore know its limits. The government must know where it should stop and allow the market to operate, because the market is much better at doing things than the government. Let us take, for example, the vexed issue that we currently have in the country about the exchange rate and foreign exchange allocation. And we've been through this argument here before many times, and therefore for me, somebody like me, it is kind of distressing that the argument keeps coming up all the time. Let me just say very clearly, there is no bureaucrat, no permanent secretary, no director of anything who can sit down in the Ministry of Finance or in the Ministry of Trade and Industry and decide how much of anything people should import into Trinidad and Tobago. It can't be done. Well, let me put it can't be done well. Somebody sitting down in somewhere and deciding, well, we have a foreign exchange problem, and so therefore you can't bring in cheese, and you can't bring in butter, and you can't bring in this, and you can't bring in that, and so on, right? And we have gone through that. I was in the central bank in the early 1980s with the EC0 system, where we tried that, and it does not work. That is a perfect situation where you have to let the market work. The market should tell you, should signal to you to what kind of price, or for what the exchange rate ought to be. And then whatever that price is appropriate. It's not the black market price, let me just say very clearly, it's not the black market price, but whatever that price is, and if, for example, certain things turn out to be too high priced, the government can then subsidize those things directly, but not do it by allocating it by some bureaucrat in the Ministry of Trade trying to allocate, what should be bought and what should not be bought. All right. So I believe in planning. I believe that it's important for the government, for the state, appropriately informed, to be able to steer the economy in particular directions. So, for example, I was just talking about tourism. How do you construct a tourism sector, a tourism industry in Tobago that is viable? Well, the people who have to do that are going to be people in the private sector. The government is not good at running hotels. The government is not good at running resorts. You can't run them. So people in the private sector have to run them. What the government can do is that the government can say two things. One is, if I want you to come, what incentives, because I know I'm competing with Barbados and Jamaica and Dominican Republic and Cancun and so on, what incentives can I give you so that you can set up your resort or your hotel in Tobago? That's number one. The second thing is that and this is where, for example, the THA could be most valuable. Instead of sitting down and waiting for somebody to come and say, well, we want to set up a hotel here, and then you go through all kinds of things just to tell them all 100 reasons why they can't do it, all the environmental this and about this fish and that tree and all these kinds of things. So on. The THA could expend its resources on identifying 3 or 4 sites in Tobago, prepare the sites appropriately, get all the environmental clearances, do that kind of work and so on, and then invite people and say, I have 3 sites here. All the environmental permissions are in place. You just come and you set up your hotel and you run it. Right? That's the role of the government.
Doc, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, that is a suggestion that I had. I kind of met with a small group in a discussion about, I think, the Rockley Point debacle as well.
Project.
And in my mind, that is what and how the thing should be done, so that you do have somebody willing to invest here, and then now you're trying to give them all these reasons why.
Absolutely, it's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, it's crazy.
So I'm happy that you mentioned it in this kind of public space, so that it guides the mind to what should be done in a way that it doesn't create issues, and it's clear as to and you come and bid for whatever area, and those are the areas you bid for.
Precisely. Precisely.
Yes. There's one other issue I want to touch because I think we kind of might be out of time. The issue of, and you had that in the discussion with Mr. Ramasa, the issue of intergenerational wealth. And I
Yes.
don't want to go down the Kamala Prasad Bisesa road, but the idea of, I think you mentioned Afro Trinidadians as being having a distinctly different approach to other races. I think you mentioned there, and given that Tobago is largely Afrocentric,
Yes.
just expand a little bit on that thought about intergenerational wealth and what we might do, as a predominantly Afro society in terms of considering this whole concept of intergenerational wealth.
All right. So the first thing I say is intergenerational wealth is extremely important to economic progress and economic development. You have to be thinking long term. So you because economic growth and economic development depends on investment, and investment is about taking you sacrifice consumption today to invest in order to deliver something tomorrow, so that you are thinking about your children and your grandchildren and your great grandchildren. That is the greatest spur to investment and to economic growth. Okay, so intergenerational wealth building is fundamental. It is vital to economic growth and to economic development. Now, Tobago, and you mentioned Tobago, Afro Tobagonians, Lloyd West used to say that Trinidad has 9 tribes. Okay. The Afro Tobagonian tribe is different from the Afro Trinidadian tribe. The Afro Tobagonian tribe has always been more wealth generating, more conscious about wealth generation, more conscious about building intergenerational wealth, more conscious about investment, more conscious about those kinds of things than their Afro Trinidadian counterparts. And I think that is absolutely true now. Some of that has attenuated in Tobago over the course of the last couple of decades. I think to some extent Tobago has been spoilt by Trinidad in that regard. But that ethos in Tobago, that first of all, that connection to the land, that connection to building wealth, that connection to family, to village, and so on in Tobago, much, much, much stronger than it has been in Trinidad, where the urbanization processes in Trinidad and so on led us to a certain kind of dissolute kind of lifestyle that's characterized by what people like Naipaul and Earl Lovelace and so on have described about Trinidadians. So to your point, intergenerational wealth extremely important. Tobago has done up to recently had done an extremely good job in terms of doing that, in terms of wealth building, also in terms of building education. Human capital formation is also very critical to economic growth and economic development. So therefore, educating your children, educating your grandchildren, and especially educating them into some of the newer kinds of things that are happening and so on is also extremely important as well.
Thank you. I probably need to have you back here on another occasion. I know you said you're traveling, to flesh out some of these, thorny matters, have, candid discussions, because this is what, plain talk is about, so that, you have people come here that would see, without any kind of political fettering, that, this is how they think about the issue,
Right.
and,
Yes.
be clear and support it with clear justification. So I really want
Yes.
to thank you, for gracing us with your presence tonight, and
Not at all, Barry. It's my
enlightening,
pleasure. My pleasure.
enlightening, I'm sure, the
Yeah.
Tobago population, and opening, eyes and ears, that might have been closed. Yeah, and so I'm just putting you on cue that at some point in time in the near future, maybe when you return, I'd like to have you
Yeah.
back on to discuss some of the other issues you raised with Mr. Ramasa, and maybe
Yes.
some of the constitutional reform issues as well. So I want to thank
Indeed.
you, again,
I'll be there.
Dr. Farrell.
Yes. I'll be happy to.
Okay. Thank you much,
Yes.
Dr. Farrell, and I trust the
Okay.
audience, would have been enlightened by the discussion that we just had. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I think it's a discussion for further discussion. Yeah. Yes, so at this point, we would close off this discussion with Dr. Terence Farrell. And when we come back from the break, I would want, just indicate some of the topics that I would have liked to discuss tonight that I could not discuss because I thought it was very important to have Dr. Farrell here tonight, to say his bit before he travels. And hopefully we can have him back subsequently to, have another robust discourse on Tobago development.
Want to get better? Where to start? What kind of exercise to do? What to eat? How to get restful sleep? Need a doctor to search for root cause? Look no further. Come to Majuba Hill Lifestyle Center Foundation at our Wellness Center in Goodwood, or Food Hub in Darrow Springs, Scarborough, or Doctor's Office in Goodwood and Darrow Spring. Contact 49 Swift 4979 438.
When the game is on, you don't want to miss the best moments. With AMPLIA TV, you can enjoy our ultimate sports package and watch your favorite games on the go. Stay connected and informed with sports news, scores, and stats with AMPLIA's fastest internet speeds. Up to 1 gigabyte fiber internet, you can stream riveting football action, cricket, NBA games, and much more. With AMPLIA, it's game on. Visit amplia.co.tt or call 800-4663. AMPLIA. Do more, live more.
Good night once again, Tobago. And as we wrap tonight, there were some matters that I would have liked to discuss tonight. I think they are very important matters in the Tobago space. And I'm just queuing you that at our next meeting, those matters I will want to ventilate them. I am talking about one such matter being this Biashara opening on the Esplanade. And, there are a number of concerns that come to my head when I saw the opening, when I heard about the existence of such a company on the Esplanade, and the kind of support it seems to be receiving. And let me underscore that, seems to be receiving from the THA, a private company. And I'm not sure if Biashara is a state company or of any sort, but I will try to do my research on it and come back and be able to, ventilate the concerns I have in my mind about the support, which seems in my mind to be THA support for a private company on the face of it. And I'm saying that without having researched it, but I will do that. Secondly, I wanted to address this issue raised by the Assistant Secretary for Sport about productivity and a clip where, I think he was there and maybe correctly talking about the issues of productivity in Tobago. And I want to delve in it a bit further, because I think the whole issue of productivity also comes from the top, because we have, CivilNet doing reports on the administration saying that they have been very poor and very poor performers in terms of the secretaries and those various divisions, and that speaks to low productivity, and the fact that GDP is declining under the current administration. It also speaks to low productivity by the administration itself. So we equally need to call out the administration. I want to go into that a little bit more. And the rhythm and soul, I will not leave the rhythm and soul until, we find out who the promoter is, because I think we need to know. we have a secretary that is not an elected representative even, and can say to us, we should not know who this promoter is, using a frivolous fig leaf of it being being the Tobago Festival Commission decision, and because they are a company you can't disclose it. I think it's a frivolous excuse, and we need to delve deeper into it. And I think, we need to have the minority come out and speak more forcefully. Mr. Watson Duke, Mr. Kelvin Morris, we need to speak more forcefully about this whole construct of spending public money without accountability, and it goes for whichever administration. So those three matters, and a few others I would want to, ventilate at our next discussion. I would also want to treat with the issue of the steel pan movement, and what we can do in Tobago in terms of, monetizing the steel pan, because I'm clear in my own mind that the steel pan in Trinidad and Tobago has not been monetized in the way it should be. And, I had some, a list of points in a proposal that I think made some sense, and I would share those with you on the next occasion about what we can do here in Tobago to monetize the steel pan, an instrument that I think Trinidad and Tobago has dropped the ball with monetizing, and I would want to share those things with you at the next session. So as we wrap tonight, I want to say thank you for allowing me and Dr. Farrell Tobago updates into your homes, and I trust that you have been enlightened by the discussions that we have had tonight. And, we look forward to seeing you back with us next week on Plain Talk. Good night, Tobago, and thanks again for paying attention to us.
What shall I bring to Jehovah? Lift your hands.